That rhetoric was acceptable in the summer of 2011, but today it's not. How about just a little bit of intellectual consistency from the left? And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's day 4, and I am dismayed that this government shutdown has been allowed to continue, even though we have the votes to end it right now. A bipartisan majority of this House supports the Senate-passed so-called clean continuing resolution, but for some reason Speaker Boehner won't allow a vote. People back home in Oregon and across the United States don't understand this. A majority of the House, a majority of the Senate, and the President agree on a deal that would reopen the government, but it's not going to happen because the Speaker won't allow a vote. This is hurting our constituents. One of mine wrote about her family's effort to save enough money for a house, but she's on indefinite furlough. Unpaid time that she didn't ask for, didn't deserve, and can't afford. Another had planned a trip to visit the Grand Canyon, but after making reservations and buying tickets, the park won't be open, and her family's trip will be ruined. Someone else wrote about her pregnant daughter who relies on WIC and won't receive the nutrition assistance she needs. Yesterday, a volunteer at the Tualatin River National Wildlife Refuge said that years of conservation and restoration work could be set back because there will be no staff on duty to manage the water levels. Researchers at our state's universities, like Oregon State University, had to put projects on hold. They've been unable to collaborate with federal agencies, important deadlines are being missed, new grant applications aren't being processed. These are just a few of the stories that I'm hearing. The shutdown hasn't just affected one agency or one constituency. It's affected everyone who relies on a functioning federal government. And, Mr. Speaker, it's chipping away at what's left of the respect for this institution. We can't afford to use any more precious time on piecemeal bills that we know won't go anywhere. It's time to set aside the politics and put the needs of our constituents first. Mr. Speaker, I understand, as does America, that you and some of your members do not support the Affordable Care Act. We understand that. We got that message. But it passed both chambers, was signed into law, and was upheld by the Supreme Court. Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't like the across-the-board cuts caused by sequestration. They're harming my district and this country, and I'll continue to fight them. Yet I am ready now to vote for the clean continuing resolution that contains those cuts. Why? Because it's critical to get the government open now. And every indication is that a majority of this chamber will do the same. Mr. Speaker, let us reopen the federal government. We can do it today. Mr. Speaker, please let us vote. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this is a frustrating time in Washington. For the first time in 17 years, our government has been shut down. I believe the political gridlock is at a discouraging high mark. I empathize with those who are feeling its devastating effects, especially those hardworking people who have been affected by furloughs, including some members of my own family. So I rise today in defense of the American people, and I ask one simple question. Why won't the President and Harry Reid sit down and talk to us? The American people are hurting. They want to see progress. They want to see us work and fix this in a bipartisan way. So why won't the President and the Senate leader sit down and engage us in a simple conversation? What are they afraid of? The President of the United States is the President of all of the people. He's not just the President of the Democratic Party. He's not just the President of those states in which he won. He is the President of the United States. He is the President of everyone. He owes it to the American people to listen to their voices. So let me ask again, what is he afraid of? Why won't he sit down and talk with us? I represent more than 700,000 people in my home state in Utah. They want the government to stay open, but they do not want Obamacare. They know what a horrible piece of legislation that it is. They know and they already see that it is destroying jobs. They know it is hurting working families. They know that it is driving up cost. They want the President to know this. They want Harry Reid to listen to their concerns. But both of them refuse to talk to us. So let me ask again, what are they afraid of? Are they afraid that they might be actually convinced that we are right? Are they afraid that they might have to compromise just a little? I am the father of 6 children. I know what it's like to have teenagers in the house. I know what happens when they get angry because they don't get their way. They run to their bedroom, they slam the door, and they refuse to come out and talk. Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, it's time for our President to take out his earbuds, to open the door, to come out and talk to us. He's canceled his trip to Asia, but I ask why? For what purpose, if he still refuses to come out and talk to us? My goal throughout the last several weeks has been to find a way to fund the government operations other than Obamacare and to avoid a government shutdown. But once again, unfortunately, President Obama and Senator Reid have expressed no willingness at all to compromise. We have to understand that we are engaged in a generational fight over our debt and spending, and that goes far beyond Obamacare. Our current national debt is approaching $17 trillion, and it's growing every moment. During this administration, we will more than double our national debt. But it doesn't just end there. This is about the reach of government into our lives, with Obamacare just being one example of how our government has grown too large and too powerful. In addition, this law will come with something like a $1.3 trillion price tag. That is something that we simply can't afford. It's critical that we work together now to reduce the size and the power of government into our lives. House Republicans have repeatedly come to the table to negotiate with over the past several weeks. So once again I ask, what are they afraid of? Why won't they sit down and talk to us? As a former president, one of my heroes, John F. Kennedy, said, "Let us never fear to negotiate." Mr. Speaker, I will continue to do everything in my power, along with my other colleagues, to find a solution to reopen the government, while fighting to make Washington, D.C. less important and less powerful in the lives of American citizens. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're in day 4 of the Republican shutdown, an irresponsible and a manufactured crisis that's designed to promote ideology at the expense of the American people. Let's be clear about why House Republicans have so knowingly, carelessly, and recklessly shut down our government. We've heard it on this floor today, Mr. Speaker. It's because they continue to be obsessed with eliminating the Affordable Care Act, the law of the land that's being implemented right now. It's become apparent that they're willing to sacrifice the basic functions of the U.S. government just to prove that point. Again, ideology and politics over people. Right now, there are nearly 1 million men and women who work for the federal government, good people, my neighbors and family, who signed up to do a job in the service of their nation, and today they're not at work. They've had to either take a furlough, now missing 4 days of work, some of whom were already furloughed earlier this summer with the sequester. That means they're laid off, and they're not working because their work isn't essential, and they're not getting paid. Now, for those of us who are old enough to remember, it kind of reminds me of the cartoon character Popeye. I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Now, the Capitol Police and many other federal employees that are deemed essential are, in fact, are working. We heard that yesterday with their courage and their valiant service to this Capitol. But they're not being paid. Many have worked what would equal overtime this week due to the various protest rallies and yesterday's car chase, but they are not being paid. Now, this shutdown is not just about faceless bureaucrats. It's about real people, about public servants who are directly affected by the shutdown. And I want to tell you about a few of them who live in my congressional district. Pat from Gambrels, he and his wife are both federal employees, and so in that household, it's about 8 days of furlough. They, like many of their fellow colleagues, will experience extreme difficulties if the government defaults in just another couple of weeks. Pat contacted my office and he urged the President, my fellow Democrats, and me not to bargain with Republicans in regard to increasing the debt limit and getting government operating. It's our job, he said. Though they are experiencing difficulty, Pat stated, and I quote, "I believe it's more important not to negotiate or bend to blackmail. Republicans must learn that they must follow the same rules as the rest of us or there will be consequences." Those are Pat's words. But I also want to tell you about some others who contacted my office, like Tracy out in Laurel. She works at the Department of Health and Human Services. She helps her mother pay bills every month. And when she called my office, she was crying. She was in tears because she wants this to stop so that she can pay her bills. And then there was Deanie, who lives in Oxon Hill, and I live in Oxon Hill, who's a single parent who was already furloughed earlier this summer, and now she isn't sure how she's going to pay the bills or take care of her child. In fact, some of these workers still have to pay child care to keep the spot in daycare, even though they're not being paid and they're not working. And then there was Christopher. He and his wife are both employed at the Department of Homeland Security in support of the security of this nation. They were both furloughed earlier this summer, and they're furloughed now. And so those are just some of the stories, and I could go on. I have sheets and sheets of calls from workers who live in my congressional district. And you know, those federal workers have already paid a great price. You know, they're the folks out at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, which is located in the county I live in Prince George's County, premier research institution, and 3,397 employees who would normally be at work aren't there. Only 104 of them are. And only 60 are working full-time, while the other 44 are working part-time. That means that also 250 of them are on call. And so 90% are actually furloughed out at Goddard Space Flight Center. But it doesn't just affect Goddard, it affects all those small businesses, small restaurants, shops, gas stations, where civilian employees normally go to do their business, but they're not going there now. And so the impact isn't just for the federal workforce. This is a really terrible situation, Mr. Speaker, and I really implore the leadership of Speaker Boehner. I know that he is a good man, and I want him to have the courage to put a clean Senate-passed CR on the floor of this House so that the majority of the House can work its will. Now, I know 40 or 50 won't, but the majority of the House should be allowed to work its will. And with that, I yield.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Request for permission to speak for 5 minutes and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, we are all concerned about the 800,000 federal employees who've been furloughed for 3 days in the government shutdown. We can argue back and forth about who caused the shutdown, but the fact is that 800,000 people have been furloughed, and it could stretch into a week or two. While we need to work hard to get these people back to work as soon as possible, we must remember that according to the Congressional Budget Office, Obamacare is costing us 800,000 jobs permanently. We're not talking about working people being furloughed for a few days. We're talking about the permanent loss of 800,000 American jobs because of this job-killing health care law. Where's the outrage over that? You see, the fact is, the President and my friends across the aisle like to say that they're for the working man. They're for American jobs. But if you pay attention just a little bit, their actions belie their rhetoric. The truth is, they're not the party of the working man. They're not the party of jobs. My friends across the aisle are the party of big government and more regulation. They believe the American people cannot be trusted to make their own decisions. They believe like how to invest their money or whether to buy health insurance. They know better than the American citizen. They want to make your decisions for you, to take care of you. Obamacare is just the latest job-killing iteration of their big government expansion. You see, it's only common sense. You don't have to be a genius to understand it. Big government and big regulation do not grow the economy. They stifle the economy. They don't create jobs. They kill jobs. 7.3% unemployment right now. Anemic growth 4 years after the recession ended. 15% unemployment among those under 25. 50% of recent college graduates are either unemployed or underemployed. I've got 3 sons who are recent college graduates. They've lived it. We're failing our young people. Remember, Mr. Speaker, that the Democrats held the presidency, the Senate, and the House for 2 years, and out of that came Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, 2 of the biggest government-expanding, job-killing laws to be enacted in decades. It's no accident that the economy remains weak. It's no accident that unemployment rates are so high. And now when the Republican House asks simply for a conference, they won't even sit down to discuss it. They refuse to accept anything but the status quo. What is the status quo? Record deficits, high unemployment, and anemic economic growth. I guess with a record like that, I wouldn't want to sit down and discuss it either. Mr. Speaker, I don't think anybody here wanted the government to shut down. But perhaps it's good that we've come to this point. Maybe the government shutdown will be a catalyst that brings us together to make some hard decisions. We've got to stop thinking on 6-month time horizons and create long-term certainty if we want our economy to thrive. Tax reform, deficit reduction, entitlement reform. These are issues that everyone knows must be faced to push our economy forward and to return America's competitive edge. If we could resolve just a couple of these issues, we would lift a cloud of uncertainty, our economy would grow again, and all Americans would benefit. Nobody wanted this shutdown. But let's take lemons and make lemonade. Let's use this crisis to come together for once and resolve some of these fundamental issues. These are the issues we were sent here to face. I plead with the Senate and the President to rethink your hardline, no negotiation stance. America is counting on us. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I've checked with the parliamentarian, and he's informed me that it is in order to give a bipartisan speech even today. And so I've got a speech that I think most members on both sides of the aisle can agree with most of. Been here 17 years, been working every day for the toughest Iranian sanctions that we could adopt. This House has passed bill after bill. The Senate passed about half of them. And over the last decade, several administrations have basically refused to enforce the Iran sanctions that passed both houses of Congress. Then, about 3 years ago, this administration started enforcing our sanctions laws. They unleashed the Treasury Department's Office of Terrorist Financing and Intelligence, TFI, and its Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC. TFI and OFAC are doing a great job. It's working. Yes, something the federal government is doing is working. Iran's supreme leader was forced to allow someone to run, one of his own insiders to run, on a reform platform, and the Iranian people voted for the most reform they were allowed to vote for. It is clear that Iran wants out of these sanctions and is willing to surrender critical parts of its nuclear weapons program, but only if we are very tough in sanctions negotiations. Let us remember why there is nothing more essential than preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. Iran's supreme leader on his website today says the Holocaust is a myth and wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Iranian troops are in Syria backing Assad. Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. Now imagine terrorism with impunity. There is nothing more essential than stopping Iran's nuclear program. In order to do that, we need more sanctions. Why? Because every day Iran develops ways to get around the sanctions program that we have. That's why we need to do a bit more, as they're undoing what we've already done. But what's really happening? TFI and OFAC are basically shut down. 90% furloughs. 70% of our intel community's civilian employees are on furlough. So what needs to happen? First, restaff TFI and OFAC. These are essential government functions. Second, pass a clean CR, because all aspects of our foreign policy, our national security operations, our intel operations, are critical to keeping Americans safe from terrorism and stopping the Iranian nuclear program. And just as critical is our credibility worldwide to really be viewed as the leader of the world. So it's time to drop demands that everyone knows the Senate and the White House will never accept, and pass a clean CR. Third, it's time for the executive branch to use the statutory authority we've already given them. For example, they've designated about 24 Iranian banks as being banks cut off from the international system. It is time for them to designate all banks. And fourth, the Senate needs to pass a bill that passed on this floor by 400 votes last July, the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act. Staff the agencies, pass a clean CR, designate all the banks, pass and implement the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act, and we may just see a world safe from the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Messer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot we disagree on around here. By now, virtually every American knows that we disagree on Obamacare. We ought not allow what divides us to stop us from coming together on issues where we all agree. There's nothing political about passing bills to help sick kids, or pay our troops, or open our national parks to help low-income, or bills to help low-income women and children. In recent days, the House has passed bipartisan bills to fund the areas of government like those I just discussed where we all agree. Each of these bills passed the House with dozens of votes from my Democratic colleagues. Each of these bills were unilaterally rejected by Senate Leader Harry Reid. The President has publicly declared that he will veto any of these bills if they reach his desk. Let me repeat. The House in recent days has passed bills to help sick children, pay our troops, open our national parks, and help low-income women and children. Dozens of my Democratic colleagues have voted for those bills, and the President and Harry Reid refuse to have them even considered. Why? It is awfully cynical to oppose helping people who are being hurt by the government shutdown, a shutdown, by the way, caused by the President's refusal to participate in the democratic process and negotiate. Clearly, President Obama and Senator Reid are putting political leverage before the American people, and that is wrong. This shouldn't be about politics. It shouldn't be about the inside baseball games of Washington and who's going to win and who's going to lose in this debate. It should be about the American people. We have very big areas in which we disagree. This is a time where that debate is coming to a head. Many of us believe the federal government is far too big. Many of us are concerned about a federal government that's $17 trillion in debt and robbing the next generation of their opportunity to live the American dream. Many of us are concerned about Obamacare and what it will mean to live in an America where government is in charge of 17% of our economy. Some on the other side of the aisle disagree in each of those issues. But we do have areas where we agree. Common sense dictates that we would act on them. I urge our colleagues on both sides of the aisle to continue supporting these common sense proposals. And I urge Senator Reid and the President to do the right thing and allow those bills to become law. The American people don't want a government shutdown, but they also don't want the President's health care law. It's time for both parties to listen to the people, work out our differences, and find a common way forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker, and good morning to my colleagues. And I think that a greeting always sets the tone for conciliatory and direct and honest interests in bringing people together. There are many of us that come from different segments of this nation and therefore have to respond to our constituency. And I respect it, and if I might, in a term that we use sometimes, I get that. But I rise today to call upon our higher angels and the recognition that this is America's country, and to disabuse my colleagues and my friends on the other side of the aisle and some of the misinterpretation that they have represented in the dialogue and debate on this floor. Numbers are showing that 60% of Americans don't want to have a government shutdown just to defund Obamacare. I don't know how often that number, polling number, has to be repeated and how often that number has to be noted as reflecting the sentiment of this country. But even more importantly in that, we're always told as we pledge allegiance to the flag that it is to this great nation, and it is because we are in fact united under one sense of commitment to our country. And so, yes, the President is acting like a leader of the nation. Maybe he's even acting like a parent. And I'd ask the question, Mr. Speaker, whether or not you had 2 children or 5 children, whether or not you would say to 2 of them, you're my favorites, you're going to get everything, you're going to eat every day, and the rest of you, well, you can fend for yourself. That is the very nature of the piecemeal legislative debacle that the Republicans are putting on the floor. I would have asked them, they could have done this in regular order 6 and 8 months ago. In this House, they are in charge. They did not do that. They have not finished all of the appropriations process. But we have, in fact, compromised, Democrats, the President, by putting a continuing resolution on the floor of the House that is the exact number that the Republicans in the House and the Senate wanted. And so in 31 minutes on this floor, they would have the opportunity to introduce that legislation, have it passed by a majority of this House, and have the President of the United States sign it. But instead of that, they want headlines like the Houston Chronicle that says, a mother, Talisha, how am I going to feed my children? because overall they're going to be cut off in the month of November soon in the funding for food stamps, even though it has suffered a horrible blow by this House of Representatives with a cut of $40 billion. But with the House not ceding to the will of America, a government shutdown, they won't even be able to get that minimal support. And so a mother says, how am I going to feed my children? And then, of course, someone else indicates what is going to happen to mothers with newborn babies and others. That is the problem that we face today. Let me talk about the NIH. I am a cancer survivor, and I am very concerned about those who are dependent upon research, and just a few weeks ago was engaged with a number of children who are impacted by the disease. I represent the Texas Medical Center and MD Anderson and the Texas Children's Hospital. Why would I want to vote against the NIH? But this own body has already cut $1.55 billion because we have already been under sequester, which is a devastatingly odious process, and it already counts for the loss of 1 million jobs and already some $2 trillion plus being cut from this budget, and already the economic pundits say that's the absolute wrong way to go because it does not create jobs, it takes away jobs. But I will tell you that Mary Woolley, president of the CEO of Research America, says on a micro level, this particular approach of allegedly funding parts of the NIH does not work. We're concerned that an incremental approach to the shutdown neglects disruptions to life-saving research by other federal agencies. Benjamin Korb, the Director of Public Affairs for the American Society for Biochemistry, also disagrees with this piecemeal funding, and Chris Hansen as well. Now, the leader in the other body has been charged with doctors, people showing up in doctor's uniform in a press conference, that he said something negative about children with pediatric cancer. He did not. What he said is he responded to Senator Schumer's comments that we shouldn't do a piecemeal type of approach, and he agreed with that. Why should we do that? And so we should not be going against each other. We should be going toward each other, Mr. Speaker. NASA is concerned about monitoring of the space station, and the Affordable Care Act is working. So, Mr. Speaker, I offer an olive branch as well. That olive branch is let's stop calling each other names.
The gentlelady's time has expired.
On behalf of the American people and vote on a clean CR. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to address the House and talk about the things that we're doing here in this House to continue to fund government, to keep the government open. If you look at what's been going on these last couple of weeks, Mr. Speaker, you've seen more than 4 bills passed by the House of Representatives to fund all of government. You've seen us send bills over to the Senate to keep government open, but what you've also seen, Mr. Speaker, is the President of the United States and the leader of the Senate refusing to take up the bills because they're not getting everything they want. The Senate President, Mr. Speaker, Harry Reid, said if he doesn't, he's not going to budge an inch, not an inch from his position. He'd rather shut the government down than to move 1 inch. President Obama has said he won't negotiate. He refuses to negotiate with Republicans unless they give him everything he wants. He won't budge an inch. And so what we've done in the House, Mr. Speaker, during that time is say, you know what, we're going to put a lot of options on the table. Because we do believe we ought to fund government properly. We ought to address the problems facing our country, get our economy moving again, address all the problems that the President's health care law is facing. But we also know that we live in a democracy. And when you've got divided government, Mr. Speaker, that means both sides ultimately have to come together. It's what our laws actually demand. And yet you've got a president saying, it's my way or the highway. If I don't get everything I want, I won't budge. And then you've got Republicans saying, let's pass bills to keep things going. Let's actually negotiate and work out our differences. And I think the American people are realizing that, Mr. Speaker. They're seeing the unreasonable approach by President Obama. If you look at what's happened in the House the last few days, you're actually seeing a groundswell not just of Republican ideas to keep government funded. We passed a bill to fund the veterans. Shouldn't we all, while we got all these other disagreements on government, there are actually areas where Republicans and Democrats agree. You don't hear a lot about it, Mr. Speaker, but there are a number of those. And so we've started putting those ideas on the table and saying, you know, we have some real disagreements over health care policy, but shouldn't we at least fund our veterans? Shouldn't we at least fund cancer treatment for those patients that are struggling through cancer? that aren't looking at this from a Republican or a Democrat issue. They just want their treatment. And so we passed a bill, and it got bipartisan votes in the House. It was not a partisan vote. A lot of Democrats joined with Republicans to say, let's at least fund the cancer treatment while we're negotiating these other differences. And the Senate Majority Leader's answer, Mr. Speaker, was, why would we want to do that? How shameful, Mr. Speaker, that you would have the Senate Majority Leader saying he'd rather hold them hostage unless he gets everything he wants. Nobody gets everything they want in a democracy. And so we continue to pass bills, Mr. Speaker, to address these problems. We've passed bills to fund our National Guard troops. Again, large bipartisan votes, a growing number, by the way, of Democrat votes that have been joining with Republicans to take a reasonable approach to this. Because, again, my way or the highway is not how you govern in a democracy. And yet you go and you send those bills over to fund our veterans, to fund our National Guard, to fund cancer patients. And you literally, on a party line vote, have the Senate leader saying he's going to kill those bills until he gets everything he wants, and forcing every Democrat in the Senate to vote with him. Horrible votes that they're casting over there to play some kind of partisan game. That's not how our democracy works, Mr. Speaker. And where's the President's leadership on this? You should see the President standing up and saying, stop these games, stop punishing people, stop taking hostages. And yet he's so afraid to stare down the Senate Majority Leader that he sits on the sidelines and continues just to throw rocks at people instead of getting in the fray and saying, as all adults in a room should get together and say, let's work out our differences. The President continues to say he won't budge an inch. So today, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue moving forward in the House. As a tropical storm enters the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to take up a bill that says we ought to fund our emergency response in FEMA. Shouldn't, again, we at least be able to put partisan differences on the side on other issues that are unrelated and say at least we agree we ought to take care and respond to disasters. And that bill will be on the floor, and I'll predict, Mr. Speaker, that you'll see a broad bipartisan support to vote that bill out of the House and pass it over to the Senate. And maybe, just maybe, let's all hold out encouragement that the Senate Majority Leader will finally put his partisan differences on the side and say, let's at least agree to do that. Don't hold hostages. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, when you look at what the President's been doing with these monuments, punishing American people, the World War II Memorial is a great example of the greatness of America, the greatest generation, a tribute to those men and women who risked everything. You know, you had heroes in their 20s that stormed the beaches of Normandy, and they stared down the enemy. They didn't blink. And, of course, they come earlier this week to the World War II Memorial to see the memorial that was built in their honor, and they're faced with Obamacades blocking off that memorial. And I'm glad they stared it down and they didn't blink too, and they took that memorial. Mr. President, tear down those Obamacades. Let our veterans into the World War II Memorial. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I come here today to speak from the heart of a true story that's happening really right now in my district. It's a story of an innkeeper, Bruce O'Connell, who's operated the Pisgah Inn since 1979. It's an inn on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And that inn has been operated really at no cost to the federal government for years and years and years. In fact, as he operates it, he sends money to the federal government. So this government shutdown shouldn't have anything to do with the Pisgah Inn. The Blue Ridge Parkway is open for business. It continues to allow cars to go both ways on the parkway. But yet what we see is under the direction of this administration, the edict has come out to close the inn down. You know, yesterday they had to close it down at 6 o'clock. So I got a call this morning from Bruce. He says, Congressman Meadows, I just want to let you know that I'm going to open my inn back up. Now, I expected to hear all kinds of just heartfelt hurt and concern from Bruce. But what he said is that you're fighting for the right thing. You're fighting for our future. You're fighting for our children. You're fighting for our grandchildren. And I'm going to open back up knowing that the cost of this particular thing may cost me a business that I've had for many, many years. But you know, Congressman Meadows, it is the right thing to do, that we must stand together and fight. We must make sure that what we do is our voice is heard. So I want to say thank you to a patriot who is willing, at great cost to himself, stand and fight for what he knows is right. And I'm going to close with this, because this fight is not a new story. On the back of the Delaware Quarter is a horse and rider. Many people think it's Paul Revere, but indeed it is not. It is an unknown or little-known patriot by the name of Caesar Rodney. His statue is in this very building. It's on the back of a quarter commemorating what he did, because actually he got on a horse when the founding of our nation was there. He got on a horse and rode through the night, through driving storms, to arrive in Philadelphia to cast a deciding vote that created this great country. Now, why do you share the story? Because across his face was a green scarf that covered a cancer that could be best operated on back in England. So he knew that by signing that document, he potentially was signing his death warrant. It is that kind of patriotism, Mr. Speaker, that we are seeing day in and day out. It's exemplified by the men and women across this country. World War II veterans who have come in and crossed a barricade that they have fought. Many of them had died across for the cause of freedom. And I just want to say thank you to the patriots across this great land that are standing up to fight on behalf of this great country. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, for 4.5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. President, or Mr. Speaker, as we have this debate over opening the government, I want to talk about an agency that people are not thinking about. The National Institutes of Health started in 1887 in one room at the Public Health Service Hospital in Staten Island, New York. It was modeled on something that the Germans had been doing for a number of years. It was called the Laboratory of Hygiene. In 1891, it came to the D.C. In 1901, they built the first building. The appropriation was $35,000. It was for the investigation of infectious and contagious diseases. In 1912, in St. Louis, 12 kids died when they got diphtheria vaccine that was contaminated with tetanus. At that point, they decided they would pass the Biological Control Act, and that was given to the Institutes of Health. Joseph Goebbels, a doctor, discovered the cause of pellagra, which was a scourge of the South in this country, a dietary deficiency because of bad diet. That came from the Institutes of Health. In 1930, a senator from Louisiana by the name of Ransdell started the National Institute of Health. It was to give fellowships to physicians to study problems in the healthcare system. That situation went on from that day to this day. Now, they tried to do it in the private sector. After the First World War and all the problems of chemical warfare, the Congress said, let the private sector figure out how to do it. And they couldn't do it. They couldn't find anybody to finance it. So they came and established the National Institute of Health in the government. In 1937, they added the National Institute of Cancer. And in 1938, they built the first building up in Bethesda, Building 6. Now, until the Second World War, they worked on various things, and then the war came, and they spent an enormous amount of effort trying to figure out the health problems of this country. People don't realize 43% of the people who were inducted or were brought forward to be inducted into the Army were rejected because they were unfit physically. The National Institutes of Health went to work on that. There were a whole variety of issues, diet, teeth, syphilis, all kinds of things that were not being done in this society, and they did the initial research on that. Now, in 1946, after the war, they decided we've got to expand this thing, and they began creating new institutes of health. One was arthritis and metabolic diseases. That's where we started working on diabetes. Then they did allergy and infectious disease, which is what went on to deal with AIDS. In 1970, there were 15 institutes of health. Today, there are 27. Now, all over this country, in every university and everywhere you look, there are scientists and physicians who are submitting grants to the Institutes of Health on issues that affect all of us. It has been the practice until very recently that 1 out of 5 of them is accepted. 1 is good, 4 are not so good. We're going to pick the one that is and put our effort there. We are down at the point where we are now doing 6 out of 100. 6 out of 100. This country that boasts about our health care system is killing it by this kind of bill, by squeezing the National Institutes of Health to death. Mr. Speaker, bring out a clean bill and let's start up the National Institutes of Health.
Gentleman's time has expired. Pursuant to Clause 12, Section A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
And so with that, a very short 10-minute recess as the House wraps up morning hour. Members coming to the floor